On a cold night, Big Shaq spots a struggling family living in their car. A father skipping meals, a mother hiding her tears, and two kids clinging to hope. What starts as a simple act of kindness turns into a life-changing mission. Shaq pulls strings, breaks barriers, and fights a system that refuses to give second chances. But when Logan's past threatens to destroy his future, Shaq makes a move that stuns everyone and changes their lives forever. Stay till the end. Because this story isn't just emotional, it's unforgettable. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The city was quiet, the streets dimly lit by flickering neon signs and the occasional passing headlights. Big Shaq gripped the steering wheel, his mind lost in thought, when something caught his attention. Behind a rundown gas station, tucked into the darkest corner of the lot, sat an old beat-up SUV. It wasn't just parked. It looked like it had been there for a while. The windows were fogged up from the inside, the vehicle crammed with blankets, bags, and worn-out clothes. Shaq's eyes narrowed. Something wasn't right. Instinct kicked in. He pulled over, cutting the engine, and watched for a moment. The faint glow of a flashlight flickered inside, followed by the soft rustling of movement. His gut tightened. He had seen situations like this before. People barely surviving, living on the edge of society, invisible to the world. Taking a deep breath, he stepped out of his car and approached the SUV cautiously. He knew that people in desperate situations were often on guard, afraid, even defensive. He didn't want to startle them. As he got closer, he could make out shapes through the windshield. A man, a woman, and two small children huddled together under thin blankets. His chest tightened. This wasn't just a family stopping for the night. This was home. The father, Logan, looked up first. His eyes were tired, wary, but filled with quiet pride. He was young, maybe mid-30s, but life had aged him fast. His rough hands clutched the steering wheel tightly, as if ready to drive off at a moment's notice. Beside him, Sarah, the mother, turned toward Shaq with wide, anxious eyes. She held on to Lily, their 8-year-old daughter, whose small frame was curled up under an oversized hoodie. Jake, just 5, clung to a tattered teddy bear, his cheeks streaked with dried tears. Shaq lifted his hands slightly, a universal sign of peace. "Hey," he said, keeping his voice low and calm. "You guys okay?" Logan didn't answer at first. His fingers twitched over the keys in the ignition, ready to bolt. Sarah tensed, her arm tightening protectively around her kids. Shaq wasn't surprised. They didn't know who he was. To them, he was just a stranger who had the power to make their already fragile situation worse. A long moment passed before Logan finally spoke. His voice was rough, cautious. "We're fine." Shaq raised an eyebrow, glancing at the SUV's crammed interior. The air inside looked stale, suffocating. The windows barely cracked for ventilation. In the back seat, a small plastic grocery bag held a few apples and a half-empty bottle of water. Fine? Not even close. Shaq didn't push. Instead, he took a slow step closer. "Look, I don't mean to intrude, but I saw your little man there." He nodded toward Jake, who peeked at him from behind Sarah's arm. "And it's cold out tonight. Y'all shouldn't be out here like this." Sarah's lips parted, as if she wanted to say something. Instead, her eyes filled with tears, and she quickly looked away. Shaq exhaled. He had seen this before. People who had lost everything. People who weren't asking for handouts but had been backed into a corner by life, forced to survive however they could. "I'm Shaq," he finally said, his voice softer now. "I just want to talk." Another long pause. Then, Logan sighed. His grip on the steering wheel loosened just a little. "I'm Logan," he said reluctantly. His voice carried the weight of exhaustion, the kind that didn't come from just one bad night, but from months, maybe years of struggle. Sarah wiped her eyes quickly, forcing a small smile, as if embarrassed to be seen like this. "I'm Sarah." Shaq nodded toward the kids. "And these two?" Sarah ran her fingers through Lily's tangled hair. "This is Lily." Jake, still clinging to his teddy bear, didn't speak. Instead, he buried his face in Sarah's sleeve. Sarah stroked his back. And that's Jake. Shaq felt something tighten in his chest again. This wasn't just a bad night. This was survival. Shaq took a step back, glancing around. The gas station was quiet, almost eerily so. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, casting cold, artificial light over the cracked pavement. A convenience store clerk inside stared out through the glass, probably used to seeing people down on their luck. Shaq turned back to Logan. "How long have y'all been out here?" Logan's jaw tensed. He hesitated, then sighed. "Couple weeks." Sarah closed her eyes briefly, as if hearing it out loud made it worse. "We were staying in motels when we could," Logan admitted, running a hand through his unkempt hair. "But money ran out fast." Sarah bit her lip. "Logan lost his job a few months back," she explained softly. "We fell behind on rent and—" She trailed off, but Shaq didn't need her to finish. He already knew how the story ended. Eviction, nowhere to go, a car becoming a home, and society looking the other way. Lily shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "Mommy, I'm hungry," she whispered. Sarah's face crumpled. She reached into the small grocery bag, pulling out an apple and breaking it in half, handing each kid a piece. Shaq felt a lump rise in his throat. Shaq could have walked away. Could have told himself it wasn't his problem. But looking at Logan's defeated expression, Sarah's silent pain, the kids' hollow eyes, he knew he wouldn't be able to sleep at night if he left them here. He crouched slightly, meeting Jake's shy gaze. "Hey, little man," he said with a small smile. "You like burgers?" Jake hesitated, then gave a tiny nod. Shaq grinned. "Good, 'cause I was about to grab some food. Y'all should come with me." Logan stiffened. We can't take charity, man." Shaq stood, leveling him with a firm stare. "Ain't charity, it's dinner." Sarah's lip trembled. "We don't have much money," she admitted. Shaq shook his head. "I didn't ask if you had money. I asked if you're hungry." A long silence stretched between them. Then, for the first time, Logan nodded. Shaq clapped a hand on his shoulder. "All right then, let's eat." Sarah let out a shaky breath, a hint of relief washing over her face. As they pulled out of the gas station lot, Shaq knew this was just the beginning. Because this wasn't just a meal. This was the first step in changing their lives. The air inside the SUV felt thick, heavy with exhaustion and unspoken pain. Shaq could hear the faint hum of cars passing on the highway nearby. But in this moment, it felt like the world had shrunk to just this small, crammed space where a family was barely holding on. Logan's fingers drummed anxiously against the steering wheel, his jaw tight as he watched Shaq carefully. He didn't trust easily, especially not after everything they'd been through. Sarah, on the other hand, looked like she was on the verge of breaking. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. She clutched her kids protectively, as if letting go would mean losing them. Shaq exhaled, leaning against the side of the car. He had seen struggle before. He had seen hard times, bad luck, desperation. But this was survival at its most brutal. At first, Logan stayed silent. His pride kept his lips pressed together, his shoulders squared as if bracing for judgment. But then, Sarah spoke. "We didn't always live like this," she whispered, her voice barely holding steady. She glanced at Logan before continuing. Shaq stayed quiet, letting her talk at her own pace. He knew some stories took time to tell. "Logan had a good job," she said, swallowing hard. "Warehouse supervisor, not glamorous but stable. We had a small apartment, nothing fancy, but it was ours." Her hands tightened in her lap. Then, it all fell apart. Shaq didn't interrupt. Logan let out a slow breath through his nose, as if forcing himself to let the words out. "I lost my job," he admitted. His voice was low, rough, carrying a weight that didn't just come from being unemployed, but from what came after. Shaq didn't push, didn't ask questions. Instead, he gave a small nod, silently telling Logan he was listening. "I tried to find work," Logan continued, "but nobody wanted to hire a guy with history." Shaq's brows furrowed. "History." Logan hesitated, then clenched his fists. "An old mistake," he muttered. "One I paid for a long time ago. But in this world, it doesn't matter. They see a record and you're done." Shaq felt his chest tighten. He had met plenty of people like Logan, good men, hardworking, trying to do right, but one bad decision followed them for life. Sarah took a shaky breath. We held on for a while. I picked up shifts at a diner. Logan did whatever side jobs he could find. But rent doesn't wait. Bills don't stop. Her voice cracked. We got evicted. Logan's head dipped slightly, as if saying it out loud made the shame worse. Lily, their daughter, stirred beside her mother, hugging herself. I miss my room, she murmured, her small voice nearly breaking Shaq's heart. Sarah bit her lip, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill. Since then, we've been here, sleeping in the car, moving from one parking lot to another, hoping we don't get asked to leave, hoping nobody calls the cops on us for just trying to exist. Shaq clenched his jaw, a familiar burn of frustration rising inside him. This family wasn't homeless because they were lazy. They weren't addicts, criminals, or irresponsible. They were just people who had been failed by a system that never let them recover. Sarah ran a hand through her messy hair, shaking her head. People think being homeless means you have nothing, but that's not true. She gestured toward the car. We have this. We have a few clothes, some food when we can afford it. But what we don't have is security. She looked up at Shaq then, her eyes filled with an exhaustion that went beyond just being tired. Every single night, we live in fear. Will someone knock on our window, telling us we can't park here? Will someone see our kids sleeping in the back seat and call social services? Her voice shook. Will we wake up to someone trying to break in? Shaq's hands curled into fists. You know what's the worst part? Logan finally spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. It's the looks people give you, like you're nothing, like you're invisible. Shaq knew those looks. He had felt them before. The kind that pretended not to see you. The kind that judged you without knowing your story. The kind that told you the world had already decided you weren't worth saving. Jake, still half asleep, clutched his teddy bear tighter. Mommy, can we go home now? Sarah's face broke. She pressed her lips together, blinking rapidly, trying to keep it together for her son. But Shaq saw the devastation in her eyes. They didn't have a home, and Jake was too young to understand that. Shaq exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand down his face. This wasn't just a sad situation, it was unacceptable. He looked at Logan, then Sarah. You guys eat yet? He asked casually. Logan blinked. What? Shaq gestured toward his car. It's late, I'm starving. There's a diner down the street. My treat. Sarah opened her mouth to protest, but Shaq held up a hand. Look, he said, his voice steady but firm. This isn't charity. I just don't like eating alone. He smirked slightly. And I'm way too big to be sitting at a booth by myself. Lily let out a small giggle, which seemed to catch her parents off guard. Sarah hesitated, then nodded. Okay. Logan swallowed, his pride warring with his reality. But eventually, he sighed. All right. Shaq grinned. Good choice. As the family packed up their few belongings and followed him to his car, Shaq knew one thing for certain. This wasn't going to be just dinner. This was the beginning of something much bigger. Because no family should have to live like this, and he wasn't going to let them. The next few hours gave Shaq a heartbreaking glimpse into the reality of this family's daily life. At the small diner, Shaq had insisted they order whatever they wanted. At first, Logan hesitated, his pride warring with his hunger. But when Sarah quietly nudged him and whispered, "The kids need a real meal," he finally relented. Shaq watched as Lily and Jake's eyes lit up when the food arrived. They didn't just eat, they devoured their meals as if they hadn't had a proper dinner in weeks. And maybe they hadn't. What hit Shaq the hardest, though, was Logan. The father had ordered only a small plate, claiming he wasn't that hungry. But Shaq noticed the way Logan's eyes lingered on the extra fries his kids didn't finish, the way his fingers twitched, but he held back. It didn't take long for Shaq to realize the truth. Logan was skipping meals so his kids could eat. Shaq had seen it before. The quiet sacrifices parents make. The things they never admit to. And looking at Logan now, it was clear this man was starving. As they sat in the booth, Shaq observed Sarah closely. She wasn't just physically tired, She was emotionally drained. Her eyes, though kind, held a deep sadness that years of struggle had carved into her face. She forced a small smile at her children's excitement over their meals, but there was something distant about it. That night, as they returned to their SUV, Shaq decided to stay nearby. He parked a few spaces away, pretending to be on his phone, but in reality, he was watching. What he saw made his stomach twist. After the kids fell asleep, curled up in the back seat under an old blanket, Sarah covered her face with her hands and silently cried. Not loud, not desperate, just quiet, exhausted tears, the kind that come from carrying too much for too long. She cried so softly, so carefully, because she didn't want Logan or the kids to hear her. But Shaq saw everything, and it hit him like a gut punch. The next morning, Shaq woke up early and found Lily sitting outside the SUV, her little hands gripping a crumpled piece of paper. She was drawing. Curious, he approached, crouching down beside her. "What you got there?" he asked gently. Lily flashed him a shy smile before holding up her drawing. It was a simple crayon sketch. A house. Nothing fancy, just a small home with a door, windows, and a bright yellow sun in the corner. "This is where we're gonna live one day," Lily said, her voice soft but full of quiet hope. Shaq felt his throat tighten. She wasn't just drawing for fun. She was drawing the life she wanted, the one she didn't have. He glanced at Logan, who was a few feet away, wiping down the car windows. The man's back was straight, but his shoulders carried invisible weight. Shaq could see it, the helplessness of a father who wanted to give his family more but had nothing left to give. Still, Lily smiled, as if by drawing it, she could make it real. "Think you'll live in a house like that soon?" Shaq asked. Lily nodded firmly. "One day." Shaq exhaled, forcing a small smile. "Yeah," he murmured. "One day." But in his head, he was already making a silent promise. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Shaq noticed Jake curled up in the back seat, clutching his worn-out teddy bear. The little boy's tiny fingers ran over the fabric, the edges frayed from years of love. Shaq leaned against his car, watching from a distance as Jake whispered into the bear's ear. "I miss my bed," the little boy murmured. Shaq's heart cracked wide open. Jake wasn't asking for toys. He wasn't begging for games or candy. He just missed a bed. A real bed. A place where he felt safe. Shaq ran a hand down his face, exhaling sharply. He had thought this was just another night, that he'd help them find a shelter, maybe buy them groceries. But this was bigger than that. These kids needed stability. These parents needed a real chance. And Shaq knew, deep in his gut, that he wasn't walking away. That night, as Shaq sat in his car, he couldn't shake the emotions raging inside him. This family wasn't just broke. They weren't just struggling. They were on the verge of breaking completely. And no one was helping them. No one was coming. Society had already moved on, already decided they weren't worth saving. But Shaq refused to accept that. As he stared at the dim glow of the gas station lights reflecting off the SUV's windows, Shaq knew he had a choice to make. He could leave. He could tell himself this wasn't his fight. Or he could step in, really step in, not just for tonight, not just for a meal, but for a future. For Logan, for Sarah, for Lily and Jake, who still believed in something better. Shaq clenched his jaw. The world may have ignored them, but he wouldn't. And tomorrow, everything will change. Shaq sat in his car, staring at the dimly lit gas station, his fingers tapping against the steering wheel. Every instinct told him the same thing. He couldn't just drive away. Not after seeing Logan silently skip meals so his kids could eat. Not after watching Sarah cry in the darkness, hiding her pain from her family. Not after hearing Lily talk about the house she dreamed of, or Jake whisper that he missed his bed. Walking away wasn't an option. He grabbed his phone, his jaw tightening as he scrolled through his contacts. Shaq wasn't just any man. He had resources, connections, and influence. And tonight, he was going to use them. The first call he made was to Derek Langston, a longtime friend and CEO of a job placement agency. Derek picked up on the second ring, his voice groggy. "Shaq, you know what time it is, man?" Shaq didn't waste a second. I need a favor. Derek sighed. This got to do with work? Shaq glanced toward the SUV, where Logan sat in the driver's seat, head bowed, the weight of failure pressing down on him. It's about a man who needs a second chance, Shaq said firmly. His name's Logan. He's strong, hardworking, and willing to do whatever it takes, but the system shut him out. Derek was silent for a moment. Then, what's his record? Shaq's grip on the steering wheel tightened. He knew how this worked. One mistake, one moment of weakness, and society never let you forget. I don't care what it is, Shaq said. He deserves better. Find him something. Tonight. Another pause. Then Derek exhaled. All right, man. I'll make some calls. Shaq nodded. Good. And one more thing. Make sure whoever hires him actually gives him a chance. Derek chuckled. Damn, Shaq. You really don't let up. Shaq smirked. Never have, never will. After hanging up, Shaq dialed another number, a high-end hotel he had worked with in the past. Yeah, it's Shaq. I need a suite booked. Tonight. No questions. The receptionist stammered, but quickly agreed. Within minutes, everything was set. Shaq got out of his car, walking back toward the SUV. Logan looked up, confused, while Sarah instinctively shielded Lily and Jake, still unsure if they could trust him. Shaq leaned against the car, his presence both calm and commanding. All right, he said. I made some calls. Sarah frowned. Calls? Logan, Shaq continued, locking eyes with him. You got an interview in the morning. Logan's entire body went still. Sarah gasped softly. What? I got a guy, Shaq explained. He's willing to look past whatever's in your past. You show up, work hard, and prove yourself. You'll have a real paycheck coming in. Logan's hands clenched into fists. Not in anger, but in pure disbelief. No one had ever offered him a real chance before. Why? Logan's voice was rough, a mixture of hope and hesitation. Why would you do this? Shaq shrugged. Because I can. Sarah covered her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. Oh my God. But Shaq wasn't finished. And for tonight? He tossed Logan a hotel keycard. Logan caught it, staring at it like it wasn't real. What's this? A suite at the Grand Royale. Sarah's eyes widened. That's a 5-star hotel. Shaq smirked. Yeah, and y'all need a real bed tonight. Logan shook his head, pushing the key back toward Shaq. No, man. We can't accept that. We don't take handouts. Shaq's expression turned serious. This ain't a handout. He nodded toward the back seat, where Lily and Jake were half asleep, curled up together. Logan followed his gaze, his expression shifting. Your kids deserve to sleep somewhere warm, Shaq said quietly. Just one night. No worries, no stress. Sarah wiped at her cheeks, unable to hold back her emotions any longer. Logan, please, she whispered. Logan closed his eyes, fighting an internal battle between pride and love for his family. Then, after a long moment, he exhaled. Okay. The drive to the hotel was silent. Logan gripped the wheel tightly. Sarah sat beside him, tears still slipping down her face, and Shaq followed behind them in his car. When they arrived, the hotel staff, already informed by Shaq, treated them like VIP guests. No judgment, no side glances, just respect. As Logan and Sarah stepped into their luxurious suite, they looked around in awe. The room was massive. Plush bedding, warm lighting, a view of the city skyline. Lily gasped. Mommy, a real bed! She jumped onto the mattress, giggling. Jake climbed up beside her, his tiny fingers running across the soft blanket. Sarah broke. She turned to Shaq, her lips trembling, tears falling freely now. We don't know how to thank you. Shaq simply smiled. You don't have to. Logan, still in shock, finally met Shaq's gaze. His voice was raw, filled with emotions he wasn't used to showing. This means everything, Logan admitted. I don't know what to say. Shaq clapped him on the back. Then don't say anything. Just show up tomorrow, get the job, and take care of your family. Logan swallowed hard. Then, for the first time that night, he smiled. Not out of politeness, not to hide pain, but because for the first time in months, he had hope. As Shaq left the hotel and stepped outside into the cold night air, he took a deep breath. This wasn't over. He had made sure Logan got an opportunity. He had given Sarah and the kids a safe night. But one job interview and one night in a hotel wasn't enough. They needed stability. They needed a real future. And Shaq? He wasn't done yet. Tomorrow everything would change. For the first time in months, Logan felt something foreign yet familiar. Hope. After everything, losing their home, living in their SUV, struggling to put food on the table, he had finally gotten a real chance. Thanks to Shaq, he had a job interview lined up. Not just any job, but a stable, well-paying position that could finally get his family back on their feet. That morning, he stood in front of the hotel bathroom mirror, adjusting the second-hand dress shirt Shaq had bought for him. The sleeves were slightly long, the collar a little stiff, but it was the nicest thing he had worn in a long time. Sarah came up behind him, resting a hand on his shoulder. "You got this," she whispered. Logan exhaled, steeling himself. He had to get this job. He had no other choice. The hiring office was in a tall glass building, the kind of place Logan never imagined himself walking into. He sat stiffly in the waiting area, clutching his resume, a resume he knew had a stain he could never erase. The receptionist called his name. He stood, squared his shoulders, and followed her into a sleek, modern office. The hiring manager, a middle-aged man in a tailored suit, barely glanced up from Logan's file as he entered. "So, Logan Carter," the man said, flipping through the papers. "Let's talk about your work history." Logan answered every question with honesty, explaining his experience, his skills, his dedication to hard work. For a moment, it seemed to be going well. Then the manager's eyes froze on one page. Logan felt his stomach drop. "Ah," the manager said, tapping the paper. "A criminal record." Logan's throat tightened. "It was years ago. A stupid mistake when I was 20. I served my time, paid my dues. Haven't been in trouble since." The manager set the file down, finally looking up. His expression was blank, unreadable. "I'm sure you've learned a lot," he said, voice clipped. "But I'm afraid we can't take risks on people like you." People like you. The words cut deeper than Logan expected. Just like that, hope slipped through his fingers. Logan clenched his fists beneath the table. He wanted to fight back, to argue, to plead. But he knew how this worked. One mistake, one wrong choice from years ago. And now, it defined him more than the man he had become. He forced himself to stay composed. "Sir, I just need one chance. I'm not asking for favors, just an opportunity." The manager sighed, standing up. The interview was over. "This company values reputation," he said, walking toward the door. "We can't afford to take risks." Logan sat there, staring at his hands, his fingernails pressing into his palms. A minute ago, he had a future. Now, he had nothing. When Logan stepped out of the building, his legs felt heavier than before. Sarah was waiting nearby, hope shining in her tired eyes. How did it go? Logan looked at her, then down at the ground. He shook his head. Her face fell. "No, I should have known," he muttered, rubbing his jaw. "I don't belong in places like this." Sarah grabbed his hands, squeezing tight. "Logan, that's not true." But it felt true. It felt like the world had already decided who he was, and there was nothing he could do to change it. That night, Shaq found Logan sitting alone outside the hotel, staring into nothing. Shaq pulled up a chair. "Rough day, huh?" Logan scoffed. "You knew, didn't you?" He turned, eyes filled with frustration, shame, and exhaustion. "You knew they'd take one look at my past and shut the door." Shaq didn't deny it. "Yeah," he admitted. Logan ran a hand through his hair. "Then why send me there? Just to watch me fail?" Shaq leaned forward, his gaze steady. "Number, I sent you there to show you exactly what we're up against." Logan frowned. "We?" Shaq smirked. "You think you're the only one who's ever been underestimated?" Logan stayed silent. Shaq's voice softened. "You've been fighting this battle alone for too long, man, but not anymore." Logan let out a bitter laugh. "What are you gonna do? Call another favor?" Shaq stood, pulling out his phone. "No." He dialed a number. I'm gonna fix the system that keeps screwing guys like you over. The next morning, Logan was woken up by Sarah shaking his arm. Logan, wake up! You won't believe this. Groggy, he sat up. Sarah handed him her phone. His eyes widened. On the screen was a viral news story. The headline: Big Shaq calls out hiring discrimination, demands second chances for formerly incarcerated workers. The article detailed how Shaq had spoken publicly about Logan's interview, about the company refusing to look past his past mistakes. It wasn't just a story, it was a movement, and people were listening. Logan scrolled down, his hands shaking. Hundreds of comments flooded in. Everyone deserves a second chance. I'd hire him in a heartbeat. Companies need to do better. Then, a notification popped up. An email. It was from Derek Langston, the job recruiter Shaq had originally called. Logan, I have a company interested in hiring you. They saw Shaq's interview and want to give you a shot. Can you come in today? Logan stared at the screen, his heart pounding. Sarah clutched his arm. Logan, this is happening. For the first time in years, Logan had an opportunity, a real one. And this time, no one was going to take it away. Logan sat in the break room of his new job, staring down at his hands, still struggling to believe this was real. For the first time in years, he had a job, a real one, a steady paycheck, a chance. It wasn't just about money, it was about dignity, about proving to himself, and to the world, that he was more than his past. Yet, even as he worked his first shift, he couldn't shake the nagging fear in the back of his mind. What if this didn't last? What if they changed their minds? What if he lost it all again? What Logan didn't know was that while he was clocking in for his first shift, Shaq was sitting in a skyscraper office downtown, facing off with the CEO of the very company that had first rejected Logan. The executive, a sharp-looking man in an expensive suit, shifted uncomfortably under Shaq's intense gaze. You see, Shaq leaned forward, voice calm but firm. You turned away a man who was ready to work. Not because he wasn't qualified, not because he was unreliable, but because of something that happened years ago. The CEO cleared his throat. Mr. Shaq, it's standard practice. Standard practice to judge a man by his worst mistake, rather than the life he's built since? Shaq interrupted, raising an eyebrow. Tell me, if your worst moment was written on a file, would you still be sitting in that chair? The CEO's jaw clenched. Shaq leaned back, folding his arms. Look, I get it. You want to protect your company. But let me tell you something. You just lost out on one of the hardest working people you'll ever meet. Logan doesn't need a handout. He needs a fair shot. There was a long silence. The CEO tapped his pen against the desk, then sighed. What are you asking? Shaq smirked. I'm asking you to fix it, and not just for him, for every hard-working person in his shoes. A day later, Logan got a call. It wasn't just an apology from the company that had rejected him. It was an offer. Not just a job, a full-time position, benefits, a real future. Shaq didn't just get Logan hired. He forced a change in company policy. From now on, the company would review second-chance applications differently, looking at the person, not just the past. And Logan? He wasn't just an employee. He was the first success story of something much bigger. Shaq didn't stop there. He launched an initiative to help people like Logan, fathers, mothers, struggling families, find stable work despite their past mistakes. No more closed doors. No more people like you don't change. Sarah watched it all happen, tears in her eyes. Not just because her husband had a job, but because for the first time, the world was changing for people like them. And she wanted to be part of that change. One evening, she sat beside Logan, clutching an envelope in her hands. I registered for school, she whispered. Logan turned, eyes widening. What? Sarah swallowed hard, smiling through nervous tears. I always wanted to finish my nursing degree, but life happened, and I put it off. Now, I don't have an excuse anymore. Logan stared at her, overwhelmed. You think we can do this? He asked. Sarah grabbed his hand. I know we can. With Logan working and Sarah preparing to go back to school, life didn't just feel stable. It felt hopeful. One afternoon, Shaq stopped by the small apartment they had moved into. He found Lily sitting at the kitchen table, crayons scattered everywhere. "What you drawing, kid?" Shaq asked, taking a seat beside her. She beamed, holding up a piece of paper. It was a house, but this time, it wasn't just a dream. "It's our new home," Lily said proudly. "Not just in my head. For real." Shaq felt something tighten in his chest. This wasn't just about one job, one act of kindness. This was about breaking a cycle. For Logan, for Sarah, for Lily and Jake, who would never have to know the life their parents fought to escape. Shaq ruffled Lily's hair, his smile soft. "Looks perfect to me." And for the first time, he knew they were going to be okay. The house wasn't a mansion, but to Logan and Sarah, it was everything. A small, cozy home with freshly painted walls, a backyard for the kids to run around in, and most importantly, doors that are locked from the inside, not the outside. It had taken months of hard work. Logan kept his job, proving himself every single day. Sarah balanced her classes while still being the anchor of their family. And the kids? They were finally just kids. No more worrying about where they'd sleep. No more nights of hunger. No more fear. For the first time in years, they were home. Shaq pulled up to the house one evening, stepping out of his car with a quiet smile. The sound of laughter filled the air. In the backyard, Lily and Jake ran barefoot through the grass, playing tag. Their giggles echoed, full of the kind of joy that only children who have finally found safety can have. Sarah stood on the porch, waving as she wiped her hands on a kitchen towel. Logan, looking healthier, stronger, happier, walked out beside her. His once tired eyes now held confidence, pride. "I see y'all settled in nice," Shaq said, grinning. Logan nodded. "Better than we ever imagined." Sarah placed a hand on her husband's shoulder. "Because of you." Shaq shook his head. "Because of y'all. I just made sure people saw what you were worth." Logan exhaled, his throat thick with emotion. There was no way to fully express what Shaq had done for them, but he didn't need to. As Shaq walked toward his car, a small tug on his sleeve made him stop. Jake stood there, his tiny hands gripping the hem of Shaq's jacket. His eyes, wide and full of gratitude, held a depth far beyond his 5 years. Shaq crouched down to his level, pulling something from behind his back, a brand new teddy bear. Jake gasped softly, taking it into his arms. It was soft, warm. Everything his old, worn-out bear had stopped being. The little boy clutched it tightly, looking up at Shaq. "You saved us," he whispered. Shaq's chest tightened. He swallowed the lump in his throat, forcing a small smile. "No, kid," he said gently, resting a large hand on Jake's tiny shoulder. "Your family saved themselves. I just made sure the world saw it." Jake grinned, hugging his bear. Shaq gave him a small wink, then stood, nodding once at Logan and Sarah before heading toward his car. As he drove off, he glanced in the rearview mirror, watching them standing together on their porch, their home. A family that had almost lost everything. A family that had fought their way back. And now, a family that was finally free. This wasn't just a story about struggle. It was a story about second chances, resilience, and breaking the cycle. Logan and his family fought their way back, but how many others are still out there, unseen and unheard? What if one act of kindness could change someone's entire future? Would you recognize the moment? Would you step in? Hit like if this story moved you. Comment your thoughts. And subscribe for more stories that prove one moment, one decision, can change everything. Because sometimes, the difference between survival and a new beginning is someone who refuses to look away.